Hey everyone, guess what? I usually do two videos every day in my series where we're going through Grand Duke Dmitri's diaries for 1906 and for 1921. But today I am actually doing a third video, so consider it a bonus video. Hopefully you will enjoy it, and you will consider it a bonus. Looking through YouTube videos, I have noticed that it's very popular to do top 10s. So top 10 greatest work of literature, top 10 greatest French movie, or whatever you have. And people really seem to like that. And sure, why not? Sometimes I like it. Sometimes I prefer something a little meatier. But I thought, okay, why not? Yeah, let's do something like that. And also to respond to a question that I've gotten so many times over the years as to why I'm so interested, or what got me interested in the first place in Dmitri. And fair enough, it's a good question. I will say that personally, my philosophy is kind of just that it was meant to be. I would definitely consider myself a fatalist in some ways, and in terms of, are things predetermined or do we have free will? Well, that's kind of a false dichotomy anyway, and I'm not going to come down on either side, because for me the truth almost always lies in the paradox. But I don't want to get too philosophical with this. I feel like there was a time in my life when I could have gone in a completely different direction, and very nearly did. But because I ended up going in this direction, it was just kind of meant to be. And that doesn't explain the draw to Dmitri, but yeah, I started out hoping to go to the film school at the University of Southern California. So I was at the university, I was a student at the university, and I applied to get into the film school, and that didn't work out. And I happened to be reading a Russian novel at the time. It was The Idiot by Dostoevsky, of course, one of his greatest novels, in my opinion, probably my favorite. And I was so engrossed by that I decided to take some Russian courses, both language and culture and that sort of thing. And I was really drawn in by Peter the Great. And yeah, the more I started taking a look at Imperial Russia and the Romanovs, and getting going from Peter the Great through the centuries and getting towards the end, and looking at primary source material that I was really lucky to get access to, the more Dmitri ended up standing out to me as a genuinely interesting person, a person who would have been interesting even if he wasn't a Grand Duke. And I'm not a royalty person. I really respect the people that I know and then have given me lots of friendship and support within the circles of royalty researchers and historians and aficionados. But I'm more sort of into politics and linguistics and things like that, outside of the focus on royalty. But that's all I wanted to say about what got me into it. I don't want to go too long with this. So I've got my top 10 list, starting with number 10 and working down to the one that is most important to me. And then after that, briefly, I have a top 5 list of reasons not to not to be into the diaries. I think everybody should be into the diaries, but if you are into them for one of these reasons, then you're going to be disappointed. So that's 5 things. Okay, so let's start with the top 10 list. So yeah, also all of this made me think about, well, why would anybody be interested in the diaries of someone who was not a person of consequence, in the sense of being a well-known historical figure versus being just sort of a historical footnote. So he was involved in the Rasputin assassination. He was involved with Coco Chanel. And those things are, especially the assassination, was historically significant. The romance with Coco, insofar as it really did influence Chanel number 5 and various things like that, is also significant in cultural history. But anyway, what would be the justification for spending any time going through the diaries of someone who, as I say, is kind of, minor royalty and more or less a historical footnote? Okay, so let's look at that. So, number 10, for the glitz and glamour. And by the way, I consider all of these legitimate. So, yeah, Roaring Twenties and the Imperial Court. And yeah, those are interesting things. And you have a fair amount of that in the diary, so great. Number 9, for the Romanovs and royalty in general. So if you are a Romanov researcher, aficionado, or if you are, in a more general sense, interested in royalty, especially European royalty, then you're definitely going to enjoy these at some level. Of course, Dmitri spent almost exactly half his life outside of Russia in exile, but he was still a Romanov, and he was still in touch with various other royals in Europe. The British royal family, the Danish royal family, all over Europe, and so I think you will enjoy them in that respect. All right, number 8, for Russian history. So you might think, a cosmopolitan Grand Duke. What does he have to teach me about Russian history? But because Dmitri was a person who thought about Russian history, or I should say more in terms of Russia's future, and he was, his identity was truly as a Russian, and so he was interested very much in Russian politics and systems of governance and how things, the civil society, how things were developing in Russia. He didn't have a lot of ability to focus on that because a Russian Grand Duke had a role usually that was separate from that on the one hand, and on the other hand, when the war broke out, he was still too young to have been given a post like something that his uncle Sergei had as Governor General of Moscow, or like his uncle. Everybody who was of an older generation in the Romanov family was called uncle, who had been the Viceroy of the Caucasus, or anything like that. I mean, he never got a chance to do that. Would have been interesting to see if he would have pushed for a role like that, and if he had gotten it, how he would have been. But, no point talking about that. That definitely wasn't meant to be. But as a person with a PhD in Russian history, I have found his diaries, when you put them in context, to be very enlightening. If you have no context for that, if you're not looking at what the arguments, what public opinion was saying, what the controversies and the things that intellectuals were talking about and politicians were talking about in Russia in the course of Russian history, then the diaries, the things he writes about, he writes a lot about political things, but those sections of the diaries aren't going to be of great interest to you. But if Russian history is something you're interested in, then I think more than you would guess that the diaries would be of interest to you, and not only during the period of Imperial Russia, but after the revolution. The emigre Russian politics are some of the most fascinating aspects of how Russian political thought evolved, and they can tell us a lot about what's going on nowadays. And so that's, in my opinion, a very good reason. I maybe should have made it higher than 8th place. So 7th place for the history of the 20th century. So I mentioned the Roaring Twenties, and for European history of the 20th century, once he was an adult, so this is mainly after the Revolution, you have some really interesting content. He talks a lot. He was quite an observant person, and he talks a lot about what it was like going to Paris in 1918. And he only spent a few days there when he first arrived from Tehran, and he'd taken a circuitous route and then gotten to Marseille and then went to Paris. And he talks about, what post-war Paris was like. He talks about what post-war London was like, and rationing, and whether you could get a hotel, and what people's attitudes were towards Russian in particular, but towards, the labor movement and all kinds of things and political developments. And he really was a keen observer of those things. So if you want to learn something about 20th century European history, even if your focus isn't royal or Romanov history, then yeah, you're going to find that very interesting. All right, so the 6th reason would be because you are interested in a particular person. So I'm always, of course, delighted to find works, memoirs, diaries, what have you, letters that mention Dmitri, that the focus is on somebody else, say Coco Chanel or Cole Porter or whoever, and I can learn something about Dmitri and what they thought of Dmitri. Gertrude Bell, so many people. And so if you are interested in a particular person, whether it's one of the big ones like Rasputin or Coco Chanel or Nicholas and Alexandra, or someone who's not as well known but was at court in Imperial Russia or was on the cultural or social scene in London or Paris in 1919, 1920, 1921, yeah, you're gonna if Dmitri knew that person well enough to write about that person in his diary, you're gonna find out some interesting things. And instead of looking for a needle in a haystack, feel free to contact me and say, hey, I'm interested in so and so, and can you tell me what Dmitri said about that person? And I've worked with a lot of researchers in that respect who are looking for particular things about a person. Okay, so the next reason, number 5, is because you're interested in some specific topic that might be covered in Dmitri's diaries. So for me, I have my other interest, parallel to my research on Dmitri, is research into the old sanatorium Schatzalp. Now it's the Hotel Schatzalp in the Swiss Alps, and it's a very famous establishment because of the Thomas Mann book, The Magic Mountain, and because there was such a international and celebrated clientele there, and because the whole town is interesting, and the sanatorium industry there, and the winter sport industry. And so because Dmitri's diaries are literally the only diaries that I have so far found that talk about what life was like for a patient at Schatzalp, which is where he ultimately died, that even if I wasn't interested in him or royalty or the Romanovs or Russian history or any of those things, I would still value the diaries so much for that. Okay, and again, if there's some topic that you are particularly interested in, feel free to contact me so that I can point you to the right direction, to the right part of the diaries for that. Okay, so number 4, because the little details of daily life reveal as much about history as the big events. So anybody who's read historical letters or diaries, or volumes, annotated volumes about those, know that sometimes the most interesting things about those sources are not the big events that the person was involved in, but just the little details of everyday life. So of course in Dmitri's case, it's not really learning how ordinary people lived, say, in 1906, because he was a member of the Russian imperial family. He was a Grand Duke, and he was not living the way that most people lived in 1906. And yet we do find out, really interesting things, universal things about how people lived back then and how they were the same or different from how we live nowadays. For instance, in a video I did today talking about homework and him putting his homework off, he had a 2-week holiday and putting his homework off till the very last Sunday before his lessons started again. So that's something anybody can relate to. And I've learned a lot of interesting historical details about life, what life was like in the years that he was keeping his diaries. Okay, so the next reason, number 3, we're getting close to the top. Because it's rare to have a chance to get to know someone so well and enter so fully into another world when you're talking about historical sources. So Dmitri was not an average diarist. Dmitri was a person who could write a 20-page diary entry, not even that uncommonly. In fact, he would do that about every 10 days. He would write a really multi-page diary entry where he would put in not just what happened on a given day, but how he sort of felt about things overall. And sometimes an emotional catharsis for him, other times just really going into detail about how things are unfolding in current events or that sort of thing. And so you really get immersed in his life and in his world, and it's genuinely rare to find something like that where you have a chance to get to know someone to that extent, because that person is being honest in their diaries and not really having any ulterior motives, and just honestly expressing what they think about things. And when you can see such a person changing and developing over time, and there are big gaps in the diaries, but nonetheless, when you fill in some of the blanks with letters and other things, which I'll also be doing, and you start in this instance when Dmitri was 14 years old. I don't know if there were diaries that he wrote earlier, but if there were, they probably weren't anything like as detailed as the diaries he was writing when he was 14. So, yeah, a real opportunity there that's rare within history and within life in general. Okay, the second reason, and maybe this only applies to me, is because he's funny. He always makes me laugh. Not all the circumstances around him are usually anything but funny. There's a lot of trauma there. There's a lot of unhappiness. There's a lot of loneliness. But he just had a sort of droll way of looking at life. You see that even in his 14-year-old writing. And so, somehow he always manages to make me laugh. Okay, the number one reason is this is really a non-historical reason. I should have put the historical reasons at top since I'm a historian, but because he has something to say. So I'm also a novelist, and I'm not, in fact, writing a biography about him. I'm writing a novel about him. And that was one thing that really drew me in, beyond my initial attraction to him as being sort of a free thinker within the imperial family and having interesting opinions on Russia and current events, was just the strong sense that he really had something to say. And again, that's a rarity in the world of historical diaries, published or unpublished, that you feel so strongly as you get to know this guy that this is important to him. This is a task that he considers one of consequence. And, even if nobody ever reads the diaries, and I know he wanted people to read the diaries after his death, because at one point he mentions posterity, and he puts a photograph in the diary saying that When my grandchildren read these diaries, I hope, I want them to be able to see this picture of what I looked like at that time. That was 1917. But that doesn't mean that they're written in a controlled way. I think when he was writing them, he also just got into this groove where he was being very candid and very honest, and using language and discussing subjects that he wouldn't necessarily want his grandchildren to read about, not necessarily. And yeah, you get the impression that whatever you think of him, and I would say definitely as you read the diaries, you'll realize that he wasn't the sort of vacant-minded, vacuous kind of playboy that he's been presented to be. Not at all. And hopefully you'll feel that way too, that this is someone who's worth listening to, because anyone who has something to say is worth listening to. All right, so now let's go to the 5 reasons. I'm not saying not reasons not to read Dmitri's diaries. I'm saying that just I don't want anybody to be disappointed and say, well, I was waiting for such and such thing, and I didn't get it. So there is no detailed account of the Rasputin assassination. There is a very detailed account of the aftermath of the Rasputin assassination, but there is no description of the assassination itself. And in fact, it seems that the whole of the 1906 diaries were destroyed, because Dmitri, when he left Russia, he did have his 1915 diary, and he does refer to having written a 1916 diary, but apparently he just got rid of that whole thing. And that being the case, yes, there's no description of the Rasputin assassination. But believe me, what he writes otherwise about the Rasputin assassination, about its aftermath, and about the way that it affected him and other people is well worth reading. All right, for the wild sex and parties, no, they're not salacious. There are moments, of course there are moments when he's being, very open about things. And yeah, so you have a little bit of that element, but if you think it's going to be page after page of that sort of thing, then no. As I say, this, his reputation as a playboy was definitely overblown. All right, number 3, because he was a heroic and noble-hearted person. Well, no, he wasn't. He was a decent man. He had a good moral compass. And when he did something that violated that moral compass and those principles, he felt bad about it. And that makes him, how I use that word, a decent person. He didn't want to hurt people. He wasn't, he was trying to be the person that he should be. But if you're looking for this sort of heroic, noble person who was always misunderstood and it was some kind of paragon of what a royal should be or what a Russian should be, or no, no more than I am or any of you are. All right, so number 4, secrets about things that were going on within the dynasty, within the state, things to do with Romanov, secret stashes of Romanov money, with conspiracies. Yeah, if that's what you're coming on board for, there's nothing like that. Okay. There are certainly things that we learn about the Russian imperial family and about how people interacted and that sort of thing, but none of them are, secret stashes of money, conspiracies, anything like that. Okay. Number 5 would be secrets of a personal nature, so that he was a closeted gay man, that he was a drug addict, that he had illegitimate children. I don't make value judgments. And for me, if he was gay, great. If he was a drug addict or something like that, then yeah, that's problematic. But people have their struggles in life. The fact of the matter is, however, that you aren't going to find anything like that. Probably the biggest thing you'll find is that he was a compulsive gambler. But beyond that, you're not going to find any hidden issues. So yeah, good. I hope that this has been helpful. And I'll just say one last thing. I don't want to end on a negative note about how it has been a good experience for me. All these years that I've devoted to researching Dmitri's life have opened up so many things to me that would never have been on the radar screen. So things about music, things about literature, things about various industries, the labor movement, the political situation in Ireland, the political situation in Germany after the First World War. I mean, things that I probably just never would have looked into. So if you read a source like this, and you're open to just sort of go with the flow, then instead of it being something that constricts you so that you have tunnel vision about one person or one topic, it's going to just open up a lot for you. And yeah, you'll learn so much. So I've also had that experience, when I started more recently doing deep and extensive research on Schatzalp, and I found that there are so many directions you could go in. I've never learned so much about geography, about different languages, because people came from so many different environments, about artists, and yeah. So whether you're doing Dmitri's diaries or not, whatever historical thing you delve into, my advice, for what it's worth, would be to always look at the broader context and to always be open to sort of going the places that will lead you, instead of sort of being hyper focused on one thing. All right, so that's enough of me for one day, and I'll see you next time with more diary entries.